Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our program, Lost Music of the Holocaust. On behalf of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'd particularly like a special welcome to our members of the Washington diplomatic community, and we're particularly honored to have in the audience participating a number of Holocaust survivors. And particularly, I would like to recognize Annette Lantos in the second row, who is known by, I think, most people here, a survivor, widow of the esteemed late Congressman Tom Lantos, a champion for human rights. Today, we honor the memory of the millions of victims of the Holocaust and pledge ourselves to continue the fight against anti-Semitism. Today, we'll learn more about the musicians, composers, performers who continue to create even while incarcerated in Nazi death and concentration camps, and we'll discuss what we can do now to prevent atrocities in the 21st century. When many of us reflect on the Holocaust, the last thing we think of is art and beauty. It's difficult to imagine how one could create in the face of the adversity and trauma experienced in the camps and throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. Yet even in the camps and elsewhere, creativity in captivity flourished as imprisoned artists composed and performed in inhuman conditions. Victor Hugo once said, and I like this quote, particularly for today, "Music expresses that which cannot be said and on which it is impossible to be silent." How appropriate for today. As a universal language, music has the power to cross chronological and geographic borders and to share a story, to awaken in us the emotions that once compelled the composers. What sparked today's event was a story in the press that our staff saw in January about an Italian pianist and musicologist, Professor Francesco Latoro, who has devoted the past 2 decades to identifying, preserving, and sharing music composed during the Holocaust by its victims. We are sad to report that Professor Latoro cannot be with us today as a panelist because of the very recent death of his mother. We are deeply sorry for his loss, but the mission Professor Latoro and his colleagues, including fellow panelist Robert Foa, is to bring unity and harmony out of the evil of the past that was carefully and deliberately created by the Nazi state. In the spirit of remembrance of the past and action in the future, I am very pleased that Brett Werb, music curator at the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum, is today's keynote speaker. And Mr. Werb will introduce us to the fascinating lives and legacies of the musicians who continue to create throughout their ordeal. One of the great tragedies we all recognize of the Holocaust is that the message "never again" has unfortunately not been heeded in much of the last half of the 20th century and the beginning of this century. Through the works of Brett Werb and his colleagues at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, the museum is marking its 20th anniversary this year with the theme of "Never Again, What You Do Matters." This theme asks America to renew its pledge to honor Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans, and challenges today's generations to act on the lessons of the Holocaust and fulfill the promise of never again. President Obama has taken up this challenge. Soon after taking office, he signed Presidential Study Directive 10. It makes the prevention of atrocities a key focus of this administration's foreign policy, both as a core national security interest and a central moral responsibility of the United States. It also establishes the Interagency Atrocities Prevention Board. Our other panelists, Julia Frumholz from the Office of Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy and Human Rights, is especially qualified to address current efforts to ensure that mass murder such as occurred during the Holocaust never happens again. In her life in the NGO community, prior to joining the State Department, Julia developed the key training modules that we and other agencies use in this field. She now serves as the coordinator within the State Department and of our efforts to use the Atrocity Prevention Board to make a difference. Our moderator today will be my esteemed colleague, U.S. Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues, Douglas Davidson. The State Department office that he leads seeks to bring a measure of justice and assistance to Holocaust victims and their families, and to create an infrastructure to assure that the Holocaust is remembered properly and accurately. I would also be remiss if I didn't recognize Olivia Hilton, who is of our staff and has spent much of her last few months on this project working diligently. It truly is not an exaggeration to say it would not happen without Olivia. Please stand up, Olivia. Thank you. And of course, Olivia would want me to recognize all the volunteers from the State Department that are helping us today, and we deeply appreciate their help. After Mr. Werb's presentation, we'll watch a brief film montage highlighting the lives and music of victims of the aggression, Nazi aggression. The film will conclude with a special message of support from Dr. Judea Pearl, father of slain American journalist, humanist, and musician Daniel Pearl. As his parents, Ruth and Judea, have said about Danny, Danny was a classically trained musician whose home was planet Earth. He traveled widely, armed with 3 instruments, a laptop, a violin, and an infinite love for his fellow human beings. Every October, the month of Daniel Pearl's birthday, Daniel Pearl World Music Days are held all over the world to honor his legacy. We are honored that the Pearl family and the Daniel Pearl Foundation have been supportive of this program. And after the film, we have an opportunity to hear the panelists about their work and engage in an open discussion with them and members of the audience. Remembering the Holocaust and pledging to prevent future genocide is not an issue unique to any one country. It is a matter of global importance. Many countries have difficulty coming to terms with their roles in history. The object here is not to condemn our ancestors who fell short or to feel guilty about them, but to ensure that we recognize what they did and perhaps how they were brought to do it. This will help us as we try to inoculate ourselves and others from falling victim to the same demons that turned what were often otherwise good people into facilitators of genocide. In this spirit of international remembrance and future action, I am pleased that present today are diplomats from the embassies of Austria, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, and Poland, including Ambassador Andris Razans. Thank you very much. They are joined by representatives from non-governmental organizations, academia, think tanks, media, State Department colleagues, as well as friends. Together, we are all witnesses to the past, and together, we'll be activists for the future. Our program this afternoon will conclude with the first known performance in the United States of a set of piano variations on a Polish patriotic theme. This music was composed in the Dachau concentration camp by Polish POW Leon Kaczmarek. The pianist will be a 17-year-old, Nicholas Biniaz-Harris, winner of the National Symphony Orchestra's 2013 Young Soloist Competition, and the grandson and the great-grandson of Schindler's List's Holocaust survivors. As Secretary Kerry said in May at the Centennial Summit of the Anti-Defamation League, I've never met a child, a 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old, or a 3-year-old who hates anybody. Hate is taught, and all of you understand that before we can rid others' hearts of hate, the conviction to do so has to start in our own imagination. As my recent trip to Auschwitz with a group of imams and Islamic scholars gives me some hope that we can build bridges between people by focusing on our common humanity, perhaps the music created during the Holocaust can inspire us to see a world that can move past hate. And now, please join me in welcoming all of our distinguished guests, panelists, and moderator, and we'll start by hearing Mr. Brett Werb. Thank you very much.
Hi. Oh, first off, can everybody hear me? Good. Okay. Thank you again, Olivia Hilton, for kindly inviting me to participate in this afternoon's program. And thanks also honored guest ambassador Davidson, Special Envoy Ira Foreman, and by hookup a little later, Judea Pearl and the Pearl Foundation. And thanks, of course, to everyone in attendance for coming down here today. I've been asked as the music specialist at the National Holocaust Memorial to provide some context for today's presentation on lost music. Those here who have visited the museum will know that the permanent exhibition covers quite a slice of history. Visitors typically spend well over 2 hours touring the main floors alone. And then there are special exhibitions and other dedicated display areas, each so consuming of time and emotion that many visitors never learn of the museum's scholarly resources, although these were considered integral from the very beginning. Probably the best known of these resources is a registry of survivors, a catalog of personal names and place names used by those wishing to investigate their family history. There is also an academic wing, the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, that publishes the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies, sponsors scholarly research, arranges workshops, seminars, fellowships, and conferences. And there is an educational division that, among other things, supports teacher training, special tours for military and police, and public programs locally, nationwide, and internationally. The museum's late founding director, Scheiko Weinberg, came to museum work from the world of theater. This perhaps accounts for the dramatically unfolding guided narrative style of the permanent exhibition. This may also explain his conviction that beyond the accumulation of data and artifacts, the museum should also incorporate parahistorical forms of documentation, such as music, into its collecting mission. So now to the point. The museum collects music in all media, including sheet music and printed and manuscript scores. These works fall into several categories of what we might call mission relevance. Most on target would be texted and instrumental music composed by victims during the period in question, liberally 1933 to 1945. This means primarily not instrumental music or classical music, but topical songs, mostly in Yiddish, the primary language of the majority of victims. Songs created and circulated in the ghettos, camps, and hiding places, and in partisan outposts. We continue to actively seek this kind of material, and somewhat to my surprise, we continue to find it. Radiating backward and outward from this core repertoire would be music by not yet victims, which is an admittedly odd-sounding category, although sometimes dating from well before the Nazi era. Music by émigré composers who fled the Nazi threat. It's just sometimes grouped under this controversial rubric, degenerate music. And works written in memoriam, to commemorate Holocaust victims and events. As well, we try to collect music representative of communal traditions now destroyed. My own special focus is on the topical music, songs that deal directly with then current events. These are, for the most part, hastily thrown together productions that, however, communicate on a personal and urgent level, something that professionally crafted art music often cannot. There survive topical songs from dozens of ghettos, for example, that tell of local events written out of an immediate need to document a shard of history that would otherwise be lost to memory. Such material, traditionally of interest to folklorists, literary scholars, and historians, is increasingly drawing the attention of present-day musicians and musicologists, not to mention historians of the period who can sometimes find fresh information in this untapped source. I began working at the museum before it opened in 1993, helping to build and maintain its sound archive and music collections, going on to produce music programs and to meet and interview musician survivors. The museum has also released a series of original CDs, most recently this one, which I'll get back to by and by. And another current music venue is the online exhibition, Music of the Holocaust. This is a slow-growth annotated anthology of noteworthy items from the collection, and it serves as a sort of guided virtual tour of the museum's music resources. I think we can switch on the website now, which will be done by screenshot. This is what it looks like from the homepage. Since the idea for this program here was sparked by an NPR story about a collector and performer, our friend Francesco Lortoro, I've chosen to devote the rest of my presentation to discussion of the role collectors have played in salvaging and publicizing this lost music of the Holocaust. There have been many such collectors, some of whom began gathering material even before the end of the war, because they were certain of its ultimate historical value. Now here I'll stick to material which is closest to hand, 3 important collections that have found their way to the archives of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The museum's largest individual music collection was acquired from the estate of the Polish camp survivor Aleksander Kulishevich. And now, first slide, please. Kulishevich was born in Krakow in 1918. An anti-authoritarian spirit from the start, he wrote a mildly seditious essay for a student newspaper shortly after the German conquest, was promptly imprisoned by the Gestapo, and spent more than 5 years as a Polish political prisoner at Sachsenhausen camp near Berlin. There he became something of a camp troubadour, a poet, player, and songwriter. He favored broadsides, songs of attack, whose aggressive language and macabre imagery mirrored what he took to be grotesque circumstances. He also memorized many more songs created and performed by his fellow inmates. By collecting this repertoire, Kulishevich initially hoped to document the suffering he and others endured in the camp. He himself survived acts of torture and eventually a death march before being liberated by the Red Army in May 1945. After the war, Kulishevich worked as a journalist but could never put the war and the camp far behind him. He began corresponding with musicians, survivors, anywhere he could find them, recording stories, adding music and songs to his rapidly expanding personal archive. Collecting camp-related music, poetry, artwork, and survivor testimonies became an obsessive pursuit that probably helped him endure his own survival. Beginning in the later 1960s, he went on to a second career as a performer, recording artist, and frustrated author of a massive study of music in the camps, unpublishable in communist Poland. He died in 1982, not long after martial law took effect. Although Kulishevich's major project, that monumental survey of cultural life in the camps and the vital role music played as a means of survival for many prisoners, remained unpublished at the time of his death, the archive he left stands as the largest single collection of music composed in the camps. And if perhaps somewhat biased toward the experiences of his fellow Polish political hostages and POWs, the collection also includes much material on other nationals, including Jews caught up in the camp system, all quite relevant to the documentation and study of the phenomenon sometimes called spiritual resistance. Kulishevich considered his own music, and he composed over 50 songs at Sachsenhausen, to be a form of documentation. As he wrote, I'm quoting, "In the camp, I tried under all circumstances to create verses that would serve as direct poetical reportage. I used my memory as a living archive." Kulishevich's songs, for the most part, are darkly humorous ballads concerning the sadistic treatment of prisoners. Performed at secret gatherings, imbued with biting wit and subversive attitude, these songs helped inmates cope with their hunger and despair, raised morale, and offered hope of survival. There's a photo of Kulishevich performing, and that guitar also is in our collection. We'll hear one of Kulishevich's pieces, a typically personal and somewhat hallucinatory reminiscence of the sadistic sporting competitions held at Sachsenhausen. The song is titled Moja Brama, My Gate. I'll read from the CD booklet. I mentioned the CD. This is an album of Kulishevich's archival recordings released by the museum a couple of years ago. And just to understand the song better, we'll see the lyrics up. Enforced exercise, so-called sport, was a frequent means of torture in the camps. At Sachsenhausen, SS men commanded prisoners to perform the so-called Indian dance, forcing inmates to quickly and repeatedly raise their arms, stare at the sky, twist their bodies, drop to the ground, and stand up again. Many became dizzy or ill or fell exhausted to the ground. Kuliszewicz's coping mechanism was to focus on the camp gait, much as a ballet dancer might spot a distant object and remain balanced while turning. The image of the gait burned into his consciousness and remained among his most indelible impressions of camp life. We can hear that selection now.
Moja, moja, moja brama, zamykana, zamykana, hargenau. Moja, moja, moja brama, zakichana, zakichana, alte Sau. Moja, moja śliczna, moja bramusia, wszystkich połknie i nikogo nie puszcza. Moja, moja drania brama, będziesz łajzo wyłamana na 102. Moja, moja śliczna, moja bramusia, wszystkich połknie i nikogo nie puszcza. Moja, moja drania brama, będziesz łajzo wyłamana na 102.
And I should say that the piano piece we'll be hearing later live this afternoon was among the works Kuliszewicz collected from his informants, and now to be found in the museum's archive. I look forward to hearing this performed by Mr. Biniaz-Harris. The second collector I'd like to talk about is Benjamin Stonehill. Born Benjamin Steinberg in 1906 in Suwałki, Poland, Stonehill immigrated to the US with his large family while still a child. Like many of his generation, he strived to assimilate into the American cultural mainstream. And he at least achieved outward success as the proprietor of his own small flooring business in New York City. Unlike most of his fellow immigrants, however, Stonehill became preoccupied with documenting the vast, lost Yiddish-speaking world he'd come from, a world that, after the war, seemed to him to be verging on extinction. We'll have the next slide, Jackie. Here's a photo of Ben Stonehill posed with his two sons near their home in Sunnyside, Queens. An opportunity to fulfill his long-held dream of becoming a Sammler, an amateur Jewish folklorist, came in 1948 when he learned that the Hotel Marseille in Manhattan had become a major gathering point for newly arrived war refugees. Stonehill took a part-time and unneeded job at a wire recorder company just to get hold of this equipment. And nearly every weekend that summer, he schlepped this heavy machine by subway to the Hotel Marseille. During the course of this unique fieldwork, Stonehill documented an unparalleled cross-section of music then current among Jewish displaced persons and recent survivors, ranging from religious melodies to pre-war folk and popular songs in Polish, Yiddish, and Russian, from Soviet propagandist ballads to Zionist pioneer anthems, from songs recalled from ghettos and camps to lyrics relating the experiences of stateless and often hopeless DPs. The inventory he eventually drew up lists 1,054 separate titles. We'll hear one of these songs, a Yiddish piece of unknown origin entitled Der Nomen Yid, the name Jew. We'll hear the music, please.
Oi der Nomen Yid, tam is der Bamir Tayer. Fa dem Nomen Yid, oi bante mein Weib in der Feier. Sis vermacht fa mir de Teuren. Weil ich bin a Yid geboren, a Yid, vor dem Nomen Yid.
Finally, I very much want to mention the museum's newest major music edition, the David Bloch Collection. Bloch was an American musicologist born in Seattle in 1939. Like Francesco Lotoro, he was a virtuoso pianist with a repertoire ranging from, in Bloch's case, his beloved Scott Joplin and George Gershwin, to the thorniest of musical modernists. In his early 30s, Bloch immigrated to Israel and took up a teaching position at Tel Aviv University. There he is. Thanks. Academically, Bloch's chief focus had been on the American and later Israeli musical avant-garde. But the real turning point in his career came in the mid-1980s when he first encountered the book Music of Terezin, a pioneer study of the phenomenon of music making in a Nazi camp by the Czech-American scholar Leon Kaczmarek. Wanting to follow up on the book's leads and hoping to gather fresh information, Bloch sought out surviving musicians in Israel, Europe, and the US. Among the many he met and befriended was the pianist Edith Krauss, who in Terezin had first performed the sonatas of Victor Ullmann, the composer whose photo appears on our program flyers. Bloch's encounter with the music of Terezin, or Theresienstadt as the camp was known in German, not only altered the course of his academic interests, but transformed his life course as well. Like Alexander Kulishevich before him and Francesco Lotoro afterwards, he felt driven to document and preserve as much of this musical legacy as he possibly could. He traveled widely to visit archives and do field work, and he eventually conducted over 100 interviews. He edited and published music scores, wrote articles, consulted on and appeared in documentary films, performed innumerable concerts, and issued an impressive series of recordings. Bloch also founded and for 25 years directed the Terezin Music Memorial Project, located in Israel and without doubt the best resource of its kind anywhere. Through this self-created foundation's activities, Bloch drew fresh attention to Terezin's major musical figures. Such names as Victor Ullmann, Pavel Haas, Hans Krasse, Gideon Klein, and Ilse Weber are far better known today than they were before he began his work. But Bloch, in his effort to locate, publish, and record the totality of the camp's music, also shone light on many of Terezin's more obscure figures, among them Egon Leidetz, Zygmunt Schul, James Simon, Carlo Taube. And he died prematurely just about 3 years ago, leaving several projects unfinished. As the world of music scholarship and performance is indebted to him for his unsurpassed body of work, so is my institution grateful to his family, his widow, Emily Berenson Bloch, and their children, Ari and Benjamin, for donating his archive to the museum. As Emily wrote in a remembrance available online, and which I've been somewhat paraphrasing and plundering in my remarks here, it was not just a resurrection of a people, or of a people's past that fascinated David, but also breathing new life into the works of composers whose careers and lives were so tragically cut short. The Bloch collection hasn't yet been fully integrated into the museum's archive. But to end my presentation, I'd like to play a small piece that can provide at least a taste of the type of material he collected and studied. So this is a brief a cappella madrigal by the promising Czech composer Gideon Klein, who's believed to have died in an Auschwitz subcamp at the age of 24 after being deported from Terezin. This piece is skilled and assured, and while the text might seem trivial given the circumstances, if understood in context, it can offer some insight into the cultural and social lives of camp prisoners. It was written as a birthday tribute to an influential member of the Jewish ruling council, a man whose duties included, for example, determining the number of hours that Gideon Klein might have access to the camp's piano. As we can hear now, this brief piece titled Spruch, here's to you, a toast. Music, please.
Stoßet an, stoßet an, wer niemals trunken, hat seine Beschlechte seht. Stoßet an, was ist Tag und Jahr versunken, wie die Stunde Wein, sein für dich im Erdentale, Freud und Tröste Leben lang.
Thank you again. I look forward to fielding questions now, or would that be a little later on? Later on when we meet with the other presenters. Thank you all.
Alice Sommer-Herz was born in Prague on November the 26th, 1903. She became a pianist of distinction, but was imprisoned in the Theresienstadt concentration camp with her 6-year-old son. She lost both her mother and her husband in Nazi death camps, but Gigi Sommer and her son survived. At 106, she still lives alone in a small flat in London and practices the piano for 2.5 hours every day. At 104, she became famous internationally through a best-selling book about her life called A Garden of Eden in Hell, published in 7 languages, and through being the star of a prize-winning film, We Want the Light, which has won her a following in many parts of the world.
It is good not to forget, of course, but it was always the same. I believe after the Inquisition it was, now nobody speaks about the Inquisition. And there were terrible times in history, from the Bible on. Terrible time. You forget and you have, it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. In the whole, people don't learn. They don't learn. When you ask me what I learned in my long life, so I can answer you, first of all, I am grateful to my mother that she was interested in we are 5 children, to learn, to know, this is a basis. And then to be thankful. For instance, as a survivor, as I am with my son, thankful for everything, for being not hungry, being in a good health, of course, seeing the sun, seeing a smile of a nice word of somebody, everything is at present. Everything. This I learned, to be thankful for everything.
Far from father, far from mother, far from sister, far from brother, fellow prisoners dear. Not from thieving, nor deceiving, nor from cheating, nor wife beating, are we locked in here. Numbers, that's what we are now, numbers. At it anyhow, we make us up, that's mighty rum. And so, full of awful numbers, right in spite of numbers, we make light of wait for the day when we all meet. Beat it, skip it, hope it, without numbers. Come and join us in this chorus, words and music written for us, fellow prisoners dear. Sing with gladness, make it snappy, cork up sadness, let's be happy, whilst we're locked in here. Numbers, that's what we are now, numbers. At it anyhow, we make us up, that's mighty rum. And so full of awful numbers, right in spite of numbers, we make light of wait for the day when we all meet. Beat it, skip it, hope it, without numbers.
We are grateful to the State Department and the organizers of this event for the opportunity to say a few words before your unique concert, featuring lost music of the Holocaust. 11 years ago, when our son Danny was in captivity and millions of people around the world were praying for his safe return, we could not imagine that he would be murdered for his identity and come to symbolize the inhumanity of modern-day anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Danny's murder was not our first encounter with hatred and intolerance. My grandparents perished 60 years earlier in Auschwitz in the genocide of 1942. Ruth's brother was killed in a genocidal assault on Israel in 1948. And now Daniel, our son, a champion of friendship, truth, and humanity, killed by a new strand of hatred that threatens the future of the 21st century. Situated thousands of miles apart and executed under different circumstances by people of a different faith, language, and purpose, these three tragedies illuminate each other and unveil the historical thread in which they were embedded. They remind us that mankind is not immune to its genocidal tendencies and that hatred of all forms must be addressed with vigilance and timely action before it takes roots in the minds of millions. Your music tonight, lost music of the Holocaust, symbolizes the continuity of our vigilance and the tenacity of our determination to remember and to act. May this music blend with the global symphony of Daniel Pearl World Music Days and advance us an inch closer to a hate-free world. And may you all be blessed with the conviction that part of that inch is yours.
Thank you. I think the panel here has a bit of a hard act to follow after the speech we've heard and the moving presentations and finally the words of Judea Pearl, but I'm sure we'll try to do our best. I think I can speak for the panelists. We should all begin, I think, by introducing ourselves and saying a bit about what we do. As my esteemed colleague, Ira Foreman, said, I'm Douglas Davidson. I'm the Special Envoy for Holocaust issues here at the State Department, a job that has several facets, and one of which deals a bit with looted cultural properties and art and music. And I think it's quite interesting to contemplate what we've just seen and what we're about to hear, because, again, I have to salute Olivia Hilton, who seems to be tireless at organizing events and nice in including me. And about 6 months ago, I think, we were in the same setting discussing what seemed at first a very different topic, which was the Holocaust by bullets, which is particularly the work of a particular French priest, Patrick Desbois, in searching what I can only call as lost mass graves and uncovering them and finding out who was buried in them. But I think there's a certain connection, because the title of this event is Lost Music of the Holocaust, but in fact, through the work of people like Mr. Verb here and others, it's being rediscovered, and I think it's important that this happens as well. So let me, rather than talking through the whole 45 minutes we have allocated, let me start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves and say a few words. Then I may exercise a moderator's prerogative and ask them a couple of questions, but we'll throw the floor open to you for questions. There are microphones here, and I'm sure all of our colleagues would appreciate it if you'd introduce yourself before posing the question. But let's start with Ms. Fromholtz, and there should be a microphone there. I can give you this one. And
thank you.
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Davidson. Thank you also, Special Envoy Foreman. And many thanks to the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, especially Olivia Hilton, for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. As Ambassador Davidson just said, I think that this is an extraordinarily hard act to follow, but I will do my best. As Special Envoy Foreman mentioned in his remarks, just over a year ago, President Obama established the Atrocities Prevention Board, or APB, to improve the U.S. government's capacity to work in a coordinated fashion to prevent and mitigate mass atrocities against civilians. The APB is a senior-level interagency policymaking board that coordinates the work of a dozen departments and agencies, including the Departments of State, Defense, Treasury, Justice, Homeland Security, USAID, and the intelligence community, among others. The State Department is represented on the board by the Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, for whom I work. At each stage of an atrocity, there are potential interventions that can prevent atrocities, mitigate their impact, or deter perpetrators. By intervention, I do not mean necessarily military intervention. I use that term to include the range of diplomatic, economic, and other means we have to try to influence perpetrators and those who support them, as well as to protect civilians. The earlier we seek to intervene, of course, the more options we have. As time goes on, and as information about an imminent atrocity shifts from early warning signs to evidence of ongoing crimes, we have fewer and generally more costly options. To improve the U.S. government's capacity to choose and implement the right options for any given situation, the APB serves two primary purposes. The first is identifying and addressing atrocity threats. The APB scans the horizon for atrocity threats and reviews particular countries of concern to make sure that we as the U.S. government are doing all that we can to prevent the next outbreak of mass violence against civilians. Second is overseeing the development and coordination of tools and policies. The board is shepherding a number of initiatives in areas such as early warning, multilateral capacity building, accountability, and training. I had already wanted to highlight the efforts the State Department is taking to fulfill the goal, the APB's goal on training, before we saw the film in which I think it was Mrs. Hertz who said over and over, people don't learn, highlighting again how important it is not only that people learn from the past, but we learn the most that we can to try to prevent these grave crimes. Training of State Department officers is critical because officers overseas, as well as in Washington, need to know, for example, the particular factors that indicate an increased risk of atrocities in a particular country, as well as particular means of trying to decrease those risks. And it's not only the State Department that's training our officers. The APB is shepherding efforts by almost every agency represented on it to increase the knowledge and education of officers, both overseas and in Washington. Training on atrocities prevention isn't new to the State Department, but we are seeking to expand it. The Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor has long included a module on atrocities prevention in its human rights course at the Foreign Service Institute. That module uses a simulation exercise that actually puts students in the role of State Department officers overseas at an embassy and in Washington, grappling with a complex emerging atrocity and sometimes grappling with differences in views between Washington and overseas. The Bureau of International Organizations, which is also a key part of the State Department's work on the APB, worked with the Foreign Service Institute recently to create a new atrocities prevention course that focuses on working through multilateral institutions. And finally, we are also seeking to increase atrocities-specific training for officers going to posts identified by our intelligence community as being at particular risk for atrocities. There's a great deal more work that the Atrocities Prevention Board does, but I was asked to give only brief remarks, so I look forward to answering any questions that people may have in our question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask Mr. Foe to go next because he has one of the most fascinating titles of any panelist I've encountered, which I think is co-producer, music director of Creativity in Captivity.
Yes.
I wonder if you could explain all of this to
Well,
us.
thank you. I, too, am honored to be here with Ambassador Davidson and Envoy Foreman and our distinguished panelists. I'm co-producer because my other co is my wife and partner in business and crime, Honora Foa, and she will be around also. I recommend you take advantage of her being here during the reception if you have any questions. But Creativity in Captivity it's a pretty unique organization. We have a special niche. We begin with the question of how is it possible to retain one's humanity, our humanity, in the worst of all circumstances. When everything is taken from us, what remains that allows us to survive not only, or not even in body, but in spirit? As we know, the purpose of the Holocaust was not simply to murder or extinguish people, but the tortures devised were often specifically designed to murder the soul and the spirit of the individuals, to denigrate them. Everything was done in these circumstances to strip the captives of their individuality and their humanity, and to fill them with despair before they were even executed. But some people did survive, in soul, if not in body, through creative work. And that's where we focus. Creativity in Captivity focuses on composers who wrote music inside the concentration camps, and through Professor Francisco Latoro, who sadly can't be with us today, who's been seeking out, discovering, authenticating, archiving music that was written, only music that was written by those while they were in the concentration and internment camps. Excuse me, I'm getting over a good bronchitis here. Professor Latoro's collection numbers almost 5,000 now, and it's different. We recently, a few weeks ago, Brett and I were in Barletta, Italy, with Honora and with Professor Latoro and a crew from the BBC to start filming a documentary. And what's amazing is the interweaving of stories here. There's all of Francisco's stories of how he discovered and found this music, authenticated it, and archived it. But then there are all the stories of the individual composers, too. And so you get this true, lush tapestry of humanity and individual lives that is almost beyond belief. He has music in a different type of collection than the ones you pointed up, Brett. He has collections of music written by Jewish prisoners, but also by gypsies, the Rom, also by homosexuals who are imprisoned, political prisoners, William Hilsey, a Dutch prisoner, Robert Emanuel Heilbutt, people who, were not just the Jewish prisoners. And so this underweaving of this urge, excuse me, this desperate urge to bring out the last elements or the deepest elements of humanity is what has come up to the surface in this collection. Stories are amazing of one man who wrote pieces of music on a toilet paper, another man who was befriended by a guard at one of the concentration camps, who he himself, the guard, took this music and hid it, and then eventually was found out, and he, the guard, was imprisoned also. The story chronicles and embodies the thing that pushes out when everything else is pushing in. The will to survive can stimulate brutality or it can stimulate creativity. And these composers and musicians really embody the best of the human response possible. They become our teachers, in our opinion. And so what we do in Creativity in Captivity is we have a twofold program. One is excuse me, to help the foundation of Latoro to sustain and continue the work He's writing 12 volumes of this massive thesaurus, the first 2 volumes which are already finished, of all the music written in the camps, but also to do concerts the way we did in Atlanta in 2010, where you saw several of the pieces, and to bring this music alive. And the pieces by Robert Emanuel Heilbut was extraordinarily moving to me, because after 65 years, these were Robert Emanuel Heilbut's world premiere, 65 years later at an American university, which I found deeply, deeply moving. So that's a bit of an overview of what we do.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Now, last but not least, I know you've already spoken, but if you'd like to say a few more words.
No, first of all, thank you again for the opportunity, Ambassador Davidson. And as many of you may have heard, Olivia gave a nice introduction for me, so I probably don't have to delve too much further into my CV. Maybe a little. I memorized it. My background is in both musicology, which involves a lot of archival research, and ethnomusicology, which would imply field work. So also with an interest in Jewish music and Yiddish music fed into my work and coming to the Holocaust Museum long ago. And initially beginning with the music of the ghettos and the camps. And as we've seen over the years, an incredible broadening, just perpetual rediscovering and recovery. In classical music, this really has been a very impressive effort on the part of many to revive 20th century stream of composition, really a school of composition that the Theresienstadt composers, the best known of them, represented. And in musicology, it's usual. It doesn't matter whether it's the war or it's the Baroque. What you're trying to do is find something that maybe didn't get a chance and give it a chance. We've really seen some of this music come back into repertoire, and almost as if they hadn't gone through this. In the case of, let's say, Ullmann, or the wonderful children's opera Brundabar. And with Francesco's work, it's a further broadening. It's the experience of prisoners making music as prisoners have done, and finding this before it deteriorates and hoping to preserve it and present it.
Well, thank you. I'm going to invite questions from the floor, but as I said, being the moderator, I get to ask a very sweeping question, and no one can push back, I hope. But please, if you do have questions, make your way to the microphones. But I would like to ask, as I said, actually probably a two-part opening question. I think you said that the conditions in camps could stimulate both brutality and creativity. And I'm just wondering to what extent that, well, when I visit former concentration camps, I'm always struck by the numbers of orchestras and things that inmates, prisoners formed. Painters were there as well. And I'm wondering to what extent this is also an act of resistance in a way of standing up. Have you both found? I think the best known thing is Verdi's Requiem, the Theresienstadt concentration camp, which is now being performed in various places as a defiant requiem, but I'm sure there are many other examples. So I wonder if you could reflect on that a bit. Why did people keep doing this? I mean, I myself probably would have just given up in despair, but I think it's quite remarkable. The second question, I guess, for you, if I can, is if, as you look at preventing contemporary mass atrocities, whether you see a role for, I mean, quite often the mass media fuels them, and writers and performers can add to the zeal to, commit atrocities. So I'm presuming that there's also a counter in art and music and things, but I don't know if this factors into the work or if people are given that much thought. But maybe if you have some thoughts on this, then I've already seen people line up, so I'll shut up and ask for some answers and then turn it over to you on the microphones.
It's a good question. I think it's a pretty complex answer. I think some of the works that were performed in the camps, and Brett, you can correct me, were done as acts of defiance. Some were done as acts of submission. Some were done as PR vehicles, as we know, when the Swedish Red Cross came down and filmed this wonderful summer camp. You know, it was unbelievable. And yet, I think what Francesco says is, or what he said to Honora and me a few years ago was, it's like a water pipe, and the tighter you squeeze that water pipe, the more pressure comes up at the other end. And I think that's the way it is with the human spirit, that, again, you know, who knows how we all would, heaven forbid, react. But I think the underlying desperate necessity of the human spirit is to leave a testament, to leave some sort of mark saying, I was here and I lived just in spite of this. So I think there are several different answers to that.
Any thoughts?
It's quite true that when you're dealing with this entire phenomenon of the war, that we have more exceptions than we can make generalities, so that every camp and every type of camp would have its different culture. I would say, if I had to make a general statement, that by far most of the music making was on command. It wouldn't be something that the prisoners willingly did. It was something that they were ordered to do. And those lucky enough to be gifted with a talent who could perform were often able to buy themselves some more time, as Vanya Fenelon's famous memoir was filmed as Playing for Time, a member of the women's orchestra in Auschwitz. So we would distinguish in our research between concentration camps and death camps, prisoner of war camps, and of course the exception among exceptions, Theresienstadt, the propaganda camp.
Thoughts for contemporary relevance?
Well, one of the reasons that I was so intrigued by this program when Olivia called me about it some months ago was because, I'm embarrassed to say, because I knew so little about it. And I think we do, as you suggested, we do hear a lot in various genocide and mass atrocities about incitement through radio programming or other sorts of speech. And we don't hear a lot about using art or music or other types of art to fight against that. And I think it is an interesting area to explore. DRL, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, they do their programming arm does gives grants to some NGOs working on things like community reconciliation and memorialization, and those may indeed use the arts in some way. I don't know the specifics of them, but I think it's a very interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, I just commented that I was recently in Warsaw at a Holocaust education, basically an award ceremony for young Poles who had made films and things. I have to say this because it was funded with DRL's money, so I was just an interloper into this. But it was quite interesting to me to see how young Polish students had gone back to villages and recreated what had happened in these films and things as a form of education. So it strikes me now in reflecting on this that it can be a kind of preventative action as opposed to, I mean, once an atrocity begins, it's too late, but it's this kind of education. It's the reason we engage in Holocaust education, in fact, which I could probably go on for too great lengths, but I see a woman is standing very patiently there. If you'd please introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ruth Hall. I'm with the Office of Civil Rights and also a former librarian and master of musicology. So this is an extremely inspiring project underway. My question is there a funding source or a project underway to get this music recorded so that libraries may acquire a nice set of recordings of this wonderful collection? Thank you.
Thank you. That's right to the point. That's always the situation. We are, Professor Latoro and the Latoro Institute, which is now a not-for-profit in Italy and one here in America, we're tied together without doing any advertising here, but just simply stating the facts. Professor Latoro and his wife, Grazia, have had to take out a loan for almost $250,000 personally to pay off for all the recordings that have been made so far. And there have been 24 full CDs made already. There is enough music, of course, to make a couple of hundred more CDs, which is the goal. And this summer, we're going to record both video and audio, Der Kaiser von Atlantis by Victor Ullmann in Italy. So there's always, that route of donations. But we are also, Honor and I are putting on, through Creativity in Captivity, various performances. We have one set for St. Louis, one set for Mexico, and some others that are in the works right now, to bring this music around the country, if not around the world, and slowly raise money through each one. It's not going to be a home run for any one of them, but by doing this, then we can record the music as we're doing the concerts and get, a double duty for each concert.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask the gentleman to your right, I guess, because I happen to recognize him, and I think he could probably would do well to be on the panel with us. But Menachem, if you'd introduce yourself at a little bit of length before you answer your question, I'd be grateful.
I'm Menachem Rosensaft. I'm the General Counsel of the World Jewish Congress, and I teach about the law of genocide and war crimes trials at the law schools of Columbia, Cornell, and Syracuse universities, and I'm a member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. More importantly, for today's purposes, I'm a son of 2 Holocaust survivors. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to give a very brief explanation and a word of expression of very profound personal gratitude. When we were watching the photographs on the screen that accompanied the piece by Émile Gouet, those were photographs that were found at Auschwitz, Birkenau. They were photographs of Holocaust victims, but they were not taken by the Nazis. These were photographs that were brought from the town of Benjin and Sosnowiec by inmates, by those who arrived, and were taken from them, presumably before they were gassed. These were the images of the Jews before they died. And it's important for us, I think, to recognize how that lost world appeared among us today. And now for the expression of personal gratitude to Ira Foreman, to Special Envoy Foreman, and to Olivia Hilton, because the second or third of the photographs was of a young man, not yet 30, standing beside a water tower in the town of Benjin. And I'm grateful that here at the State Department, 68 years after his liberation and almost 38 years after he died, you allowed me to see my father. Thank you.
Please, ma'am, now.
Yes, my name is Jacqueline Mendels-Bien, and I'm a Holocaust survivor from France. And as soon as we survived and went back to Paris, my mother introduced me to the cello. And recently, Werb introduced me to a wonderful piece by Simon Lax, who survived Auschwitz. And it's a piece that I've played on the cello with accompaniment. And then also every year on the anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz, I and my quartet have played music by one survivor of terrorism, 3 others who didn't make it, but they're very beautiful pieces. And I wanted to mention that, but what I really wanted to say is, I don't know if you read the Wall Street Journal on Saturday, there is a book that just came out called Forbidden Music by Michael Haas, published at Yale, and where the word is in German, entartet, which was forbidden music. And I think this is probably a very valuable book to read and to have. I haven't read the book yet. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I actually saw the review, but I was going to say it was in the New York Times, so you've saved me from a big inaccuracy. And it leads me, since there, May I ask one question quickly of the panelists, because the thought occurred thanks to you that we're talking about lost music, but it seems to me it's more, as what your work and yours, it's more and more being found and performed, as I gather. My question to you is that an accurate impression? There seems to be growing interest of late in this kind of thing.
Yes, good, Brett.
I first of all want to say that I haven't read the book, but I know about the book, and I know the author, Michael Haas, very well. He's initiated the recording project back in, I believe it was the early 90s with Decca, and there's an entire series of music by composers who fell out of the mainstream during this period. They were either forced into immigration or suppressed otherwise if they remained in Europe. And this book recounts his experiences in bringing this repertoire to light again. He's a wonderful writer, and I look forward to reading this book.
What was the question?
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, yes. Yeah, I think our goal, I think Francesco Latoro's goal with the Institute together is to bring this music alive. You know, if I can read just a paragraph from an interview with Francesco's wife, Grazia, she's right to the point. She said, this was just 2 weeks ago, she said, music lends itself to this, to being alive. I believe that the musicians who wrote in the camps wanted to affirm not only their right to live, but also their love for life. And mostly that they wanted to affirm that they were humans, notwithstanding the situation in which they lived, notwithstanding the privations, the humiliations. They wanted to affirm that the human mind can abstract itself from these situations. The human mind can continue to create even in a difficult context. So they wanted to affirm their own humanity. And the key, she goes on to say, is, and so we are giving back a voice to these people who have lost their voice. This means to restitute what others had tried to take away from them, to give credit to their capacity, to give credit to their capacity to live, to bring their voices to the future. And so I think that with all the incredible work that Brett and the Holocaust Museum and Latoro are doing, the next step is to bring it out, to make it live, to breathe again. And I think it is happening. Exactly.
Hi, I'm Christine Beresniova. I study the Holocaust in Lithuania. And I have a very specific question. I'm not sure if you can even answer it. I was in Auschwitz last year, and the tour guide said that there was a certain part of the camp where the gypsies were interred, and that the gypsies were actually allowed to keep their clothes and their musical instruments, and that survivors remember that there was a lot of music and liveliness in this part of the camp. And A, I wondered if you knew that to be true, and B, if so, are there any recordings or any historians looking into this specific aspect?
It's somewhat outside of my area, too, and I don't like to speak out of turn. I believe that is true, and although they were slated to be killed, that they were able to keep the families together. It was called the Gypsy Family Camp. And there has been a certain amount of research. The documentation is different with this sort of music than it has been with Western art music, in that it remains an oral tradition for many years, and collecting it has proved difficult, but is being done, has been done. There are some studies on the Auschwitz melodies from Roma groups and Francesco Latoro has actually convened some, I believe, descendants of survivors to recreate the repertoire. And this, some of these studies will emerge in his work and recordings.
Yeah, just very briefly, he had recently 28 gypsy musicians at his house for about 2 weeks. And so they all cooked and sang and recorded at the local theater. And so that is also in the works, too. And a lot of beer, okay.
I'm Steve Fenves. I'm a Holocaust survivor and volunteer at the Holocaust Museum. To elaborate the answer to the young lady's question, I was in Compound C in August of 1944 when the gypsy families were exterminated. I appreciate what this meeting is about and the work that the specialists put in, but I want to point out that it's just one medium through which people express themselves, some of it collectible and some of it not quite collectible. I was in a small camp after Auschwitz. My wife Norma and I saw this small museum that the city has put up. There were people making these marvelous decorations and wreaths out of straw found on the streets that could be traded with the German workers for soap and needle and thread and stuff like that. What I was looking in the exhibit, and they didn't have any, I remember jewelers carving these marvelous jewel boxes with tools, which were all made from material stolen from the factory, which was punishable by death, but that didn't matter. But then there are, and you know, they're well documented. Auschwitz has an art museum. Buchenwald has a very outstanding art museum. The ghetto fighters, the freedom fighters ghetto in Israel has a very nice exhibit. But then there are things that will never be collectible. In this little camp, there were about half a dozen kids my age, 13, 14, 15. After 14-hour work days, there was a group of people who sat us down to teach us algebra and French. Just as a form of resistance. That will never be collected, that will never be documented, that will just go by. So again, I just want people to appreciate that this is just one visible aspect of the spiritual resistance that existed, and it's visible because it's collectible, and people can dedicate their lives to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point and something we should bear in mind. I thank you for the contribution. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
I will just say that it is a reminder of how tremendous the loss was, that whatever it is that is able to be brought to light now is such a small fragment of what there was and what was going on.
Sir, yes.
My name is Jerome Barry. I direct the Embassy series. I'm a singer and a cantor, and had the privilege of working on the first concert at the Holocaust Museum with Brett Werb 20 years ago. 1994, we did that performance. And I must say, Brett, I appreciate all that you have done. And that time you were just so accomplished, and you reminded me of a lot of things I wouldn't have known, like working with Alexander Tamir, who was Alek Volkovitsky in the Vilna Ghetto, and whom I knew very well in Israel. And I have to say that I think it's so important for us to continue to perform this music. I've done it, I just did it last year. We did the Vilna Ghetto songs for non-Jews in the Academy in Vilnius, and I did it in Germany with in Austria with the Gedenkdienst for all these children. And what we have to do is to understand that this music that was produced came from the hearts of these people that expressed their everyday lives and all the things about separation and sadness. And I think we have to bring this message to these children nowadays and explain to them the human condition, and to try to stimulate them to feel the emotion of what this music stood for. And as a musician, I want to say, when Ambassador Davidson was saying, that musicians have to continue doing their work. That's their very lifeblood. If they didn't do it, they would feel as if all of their work was wasted and they have no purpose in life. And that's why I continue to do it. I'm a grandfather, but I think it's very important to keep on working at this and to bring it to light. And people like you are doing a great job. We're presenting the second annual Danny Pearl concert. And the reason I'm here today is because I spoke to Judea on the phone the other day, and he said, you must come and hear this. And it's very important that we remember all these sacrifices that people made. And I hope that everybody will support these efforts. Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to make a comment on the last gentleman's remarks about teachings or things that can't be, that are intangible. And today, as we work on preventing and deterring and responding to genocide and other mass atrocities, one of the topics that often comes up, and that is a big piece of the work of the Atrocities Prevention Board, is accountability, or holding perpetrators and those who support them to account to ensure that there isn't impunity for crimes like these, both to pursue justice and to pursue deterrence. And in addition to criminal accountability, there's also a great deal of work by governments and NGOs on transitional justice, which means using various mechanisms to try to move from a damaged and conflict-ridden society to a more stable one. And one of the types of transitional justice can include things like truth and reconciliation commissions. It can also include things like memorializations of different sorts. And I think in some cases, especially NGOs, have done a marvelous job of memorializing intangible things. For example, in Cambodia, where teaching about the Khmer Rouge atrocities was illegal for many years, there was an NGO that tried to do its own teaching to school children around the country to ensure that this wouldn't be forgotten. And so there are small ways, but very important ways, to try to memorialize the intangible things.
Hang on. Over here, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ann Majette from the Washington Post. I'm the classical music critic, and this is a topic that first caught my interest when the recording project Antarktische Kunst on Decca, which was mentioned earlier, began in the 1980s, spearheaded by Michael Haas. And since then, I've seen a number of different recording projects laudably pursuing this theme. A number of concerts are given. We've reviewed a number of them in Washington. And my question is this, particularly given the amount of resources it takes to maintain a recording project, as you, Mr. Foh, mentioned, is there any effort to collaborate to avoid overlap or to try to get some of these smaller foundations working together given the limited resources? I mean, the Milken Archive has done an amazing job documenting a wide range of Jewish composition, for example, and given that there is a version of Kaiser von Atlantis available still, or perhaps it's out of print now, is that the best allocation of resources you have? And my second part of my question for Mr. Webb is there any attempt to catalog all of these different recording projects? Or was the Holocaust Museum some sort of home for an overview of the recording and the concerts and all of the work that's being done, so that it's not lots of different people reinventing this important wheel?
Who wants to go first?
The idea of reinventing the wheel is a pretty good idea. It probably could be reinvented. But in terms of cataloging the material that's available, it is now, thanks to the internet, it's pretty easy to get a handle on the recordings that have been issued historically and recently. I believe that you'll find as early as the 1950s, some of this music from Terezin had been recorded in Czechoslovakia. It's true that Kaiser is a very popular piece of this repertoire, and there are many recordings of it. I would recommend that there's a website that's run by a gentleman named Claude Torres. He's in France, and he has got pretty much a handle on almost, if not all, of everything that has been issued of this repertoire. And I often look to his website to see what I may have done in the past. So yes, and Michael Haas really did, as far as a major label and as far as a series, did record a lot of this music. It's mostly chamber and symphonic. It's mostly by composers who were fairly established at the time of the war, and it's quite an achievement.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question because, again, there's no simple answer. With the Lautaro Institute, Francisco, for instance, there's just a single song written by a Sufi master who was born Jewish, converted to Sufism after the war, who was a survivor, Mandel Khan, and who just died a few years ago. And he wrote this one beautiful love song to his wife, and it was written in captivity. So it's part of the Lautaro collection, which Mandel Khan personally sent to Francisco. Well, even there, the music has to then be transcribed. It then has to be put into Sibelius or Finale, into musical notation software. It then has to be, well, in this case, it was written for tenor, and we only had a professional baritone. It was transposed, it was not acceptable, so we are waiting for the next iteration for when we have a tenor around who can sing this particular range. So, and this is just one song. And, and with their Kaiser, there are different versions, which, Brett, you're more knowledgeable than I am. And it's a matter of, do you go back to version 1, the second version, the third version, and then the resources of hiring a single pianist, well, that's one thing, or a chorus or a symphony orchestra and a chorus and an opera. And, it's very complex, as you can certainly appreciate better than many people. And so the answer is just not simple. I think that there are, Francisco has recorded 24 CDs full of music, and that's the tip of the iceberg under the label of KZ Musik or Musikstrasse. And it's just going to continue. It's going to continue as money is available. And I think with other people, this idea of symbiosis, of working in harmony with other groups, I think is extremely good and extremely important. And that's what we're trying to do with Creativity in Captivity, is take advantage of certain concerts, whether they be for fundraising or for, fundraising for other organizations, and taking that opportunity to record them. And then, again, to the ISBN numbers and the internet, it should all get cataloged. But it's going to be way past my lifetime, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, I think the last question is yours today.
Yes, my name's Paul Tyson. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, also a third-generation American. We lost family in Hungary in 1944 at Auschwitz and other places. Next year, there's going to be the 70th anniversary observances of this. Is music going to be part of it?
I don't know. It's a good question. It should be. How's that for an answer?
A good one.
Okay. I'm sure my colleagues and I will do our best to make sure it's included, because after this event, how could we not? Thank you for that. I guess on Mr. Foreman's behalf and his colleagues, I should thank all of our panelists. Is that my place to do this? And then we move on to... Mr. Verba is going to do the introduction. So I think I'll thank everyone and get off the stage. And thank you.
And I'll ease my way off stage by just saying we're about to hear a set of piano variations, music composed in a Nazi concentration camp, Dachau. Ahead of this performance, I've been asked to say a few words about the composer. Leon Kaczmarek was born in 1903 and had finished music studies a few years before the war broke out. In March 1940, he was arrested by the Gestapo in Poznan and 2 months later sent to Dachau as a Polish political prisoner. Twice the subject of medical experiments that were performed on prisoners in Dachau, Kaczmarek was liberated with some 30,000 other prisoners, mostly political, on April 29, 1945, by U.S. soldiers. After liberation, he settled in the West Polish city of Ostrów Wielkopolski, where he directed the men's choir Echo until his death in 1973. In the camp, Kaczmarek directed a 45-member German men's choir that had been formed by communist prisoners and tolerated by the SS. From the time he became its director, the choir took on a more international cast as Kaczmarek allowed other nationals to perform as long as they could manage the strictly German language repertoire. Kaczmarek was very well versed in German. During his 5 years of imprisonment, he composed numerous original songs, instrumental works, 2 sets of piano themes and variations, pieces for violin and piano and operetta, etc. Many of these compositions do not survive, but he managed to preserve 3 camp notebooks of music. And if you look at the lyre on the piano, you can see a reproduction of one of them, very small book, only 3 systems per page. And several more works that he managed to recover after coming back to the camp weeks after liberation. Alexander Kulishevich copied these, and they're now part of the U.S. HMM collection. Kaczmarek wrote a letter to Kulishevich toward the end of his life, and he wrote, "When and how did I compose, you ask? To this question, I cannot today give you a precise answer. I know that my body was forced to live in Dachau, but in my soul and in my thoughts, I lived with and longed for those dearest to me. Thoughts of them which never left me were transformed into songs." And I need also to explain about the piece that we're going to hear. It's a set of variations written in 1942 or 43 on a patriotic mazurka. This mazurka itself was written in 1830 or 1831. It relates to the November Uprising, one of Poland's most famous attempts to regain its independence in the 19th century. So it had quite a symbolic import during this 20th century occupation by Germans. The original title is The Cannon's Thunder Near Strocek. This is the tune that Kaczmarek based his variations upon, widely known to Poles before World War II, one of the great standards of the Polish patriotic song repertoire. And so in using this piece for his set of variations, he was summoning Poles to gather their courage and reaffirm their faith in the enemy's ultimate downfall. We're very fortunate to have a gifted young pianist, as already introduced, Nicholas Biniaz-Harris, to perform this piece.
talking about bringing music back to life. One more time, let's give it a round of applause. I'd like to thank all the panelists, Robert, Julia, Brett, and our moderator, Special Envoy Davidson, for their insights this afternoon. I hope that we all have a chance to continue the conversation by moving across the hallway to the Delegates Lounge for a reception. Just take the doors to my left, your right, and my colleagues will direct you there. If you can't stay for the reception, you should exit up the stairs to the 23rd Street exit. And just a final note, as you entered the auditorium this afternoon, playing over the sound system was a CD of music written by composers while they were in the camps in World War II. Those pieces we heard before the start of today's program were recorded for a live performance at a, quote, Creativity in Captivity, unquote, concert in Atlanta, Georgia in September 2010. Some of the performances on that CD were world premieres. Now as we depart the auditorium, and again during the reception that follows, we'll hear a different music. It's from a CD called Listen to the Band. That's B-A-N-N-E-D, not B-A-N-D. The CD is a collection of songs from modern-day artists around the world who have been censored, persecuted, taken to court, imprisoned, and even tortured for a very simple reason, their music. These artists and others like them around the world must have the right to exist and freely express their feelings and opinions through their art. Again, thank you for your coming, and I hope you all will be able to join us across the hallway. Thank you.